Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between safety and doing what your heart knows is right. For 15 years, Caleb Stone lived alone in the Wyoming mountains, far from people and the pain of his past. Then one frozen morning, a desperate young girl appeared at his door, holding a baby and begging him to save her brother from dangerous men. Caleb could have turned her away and kept his quiet life. But when a child needs help, some men just can't walk away. What happens next will test everything he thought he left behind and show him that running from your past doesn't mean you can escape who you really are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat in a clearing halfway up the mountain, positioned where the pine forest thinned just enough to catch the morning sun. Caleb Stone had built it with his own hands 15 years ago, each log cut and notched with the precision of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing but time. The structure was solid, weathered by mountain winters into a silver gray that blended with the surrounding rock faces. Smoke rose from the stone chimney in a thin, steady line against the pale winter sky. Inside, the single room was sparse but meticulously organized. A narrow bed occupied one corner, covered with wool blankets and a bearskin he'd taken his second winter here. The fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth blackened by years of constant use. Above it hung a cavalry saber, its blade tarnished but still sharp, mounted on wooden pegs. Caleb rarely looked at it anymore. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies arranged with military precision. Tins of coffee and salt, dried beans and cornmeal, ammunition boxes, medical supplies, tools. A small table and single chair sat beneath the south-facing window. On the table rested a hand-carved wooden box, its surface worn smooth by handling over the years. Caleb never opened it, but he moved it each morning when he wiped down the table, and each evening when he set it back in its place. The winter morning routine never varied. Caleb woke before dawn, added wood to the fire from the stack beside the hearth, and put coffee on to boil. While it heated, he stepped outside into the cold that took his breath away even after all these years. The air at this elevation had a quality to it, sharp and clean, tasting of pine and snow and granite. He'd check the sky, read the clouds, feel the wind direction against his weathered face. This morning, the 20th of January by his count, the sky held that particular grey-white that promised more snow. The drifts around the cabin already stood waist-deep. His breath plumed in front of him as he made his way to the lean-to shelter where he kept his horse. A sturdy Morgan mare named Sable. She nickered softly as he approached, her breath steaming in the cold. "Morning, girl," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Some days she was the only creature he spoke to. He gave her a measure of grain, checked her water. He had to break a skin of ice over the bucket, and ran his hands along her legs and flanks, feeling for any heat or swelling. Satisfied, he returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots before entering. The coffee was ready. He poured it into a tin cup and sat at the table, looking out the window, at the mountains rising beyond his clearing. The peaks caught the first pale light, turning rose and gold against the grey sky. He'd chosen this spot specifically for this view. In his darker moments, which came less frequently now but still came, the mountains reminded him how small his grief was against the vastness of the world. Caleb Stone was 52 years old, though he looked older. His face was weathered by wind and sun, lined deep around the eyes and mouth. His hair, once dark, had gone mostly grey and hung to his shoulders. He kept his beard trimmed short with the same scissors he used for everything else. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them daily. But his eyes, pale blue, almost grey, still held the sharp awareness of his earlier life. He'd been a cavalry officer once, Captain Caleb Stone of the 3rd Regiment. He'd led men through the mountain territories, mapping routes, negotiating with tribes, keeping the peace when peace was possible, and fighting when it wasn't. He'd been good at it, maybe too good. They'd wanted to promote him to major, give him a command at Fort Laramie. Then the fever came. It swept through the fort that winter, taking the weak and the strong without discrimination. His wife, Margaret, fell ill first. Then their daughter, little Sarah, just 6 years old. He'd sat beside their beds for 3 days and nights, helpless despite all his training and experience. On the 4th day, Margaret stopped breathing. On the 5th, his daughter followed. They'd buried them in the fort cemetery with full military honors. The chaplain had spoken words that meant nothing. His fellow officers had offered condolences that couldn't touch his grief. After the funeral, he'd stood in his empty quarters, looking at Sarah's rag doll on the bed, Margaret's shawl hanging on its peg, and something inside him had simply broken. He'd resigned his commission within the week. Sold everything he owned except his horse, his weapons, and a few personal items. He'd ridden west into the mountains, looking for a place far enough from civilization that he could be alone with his memories. He'd found this clearing and never left. The first years had been the hardest. He'd built the cabin in a fury of physical labor, working himself to exhaustion each day, so he might sleep without dreams. He'd learned to hunt and trap, to preserve meat and tan hides, to predict the weather and survive the brutal winters. He'd taught himself to be completely self-sufficient because depending on anyone or anything seemed like inviting loss back into his life. But time, he'd discovered, had a way of smoothing even the sharpest edges of grief. The memories became less like knives and more like old bruises, still tender when pressed, but no longer cutting. He found a rhythm to his days that, if not peaceful, was at least bearable. He woke, tended his needs, and slept. The seasons turned. Years passed. He'd had contact with civilization only a handful of times. Twice a year, he rode down to the small settlement of Pine Ridge, 2 days' journey to the east, to trade furs and meat for supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. The townspeople knew him as the hermit from the high country. They didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer answers. He made his trades and left. Occasionally, trappers would pass through his area. He'd share coffee if they were friendly, answer questions about the territory if asked, but he never invited them to stay longer than a night. Once a group of surveyors had come through, mapping the territory for the railroad. Their leader, a young engineer full of enthusiasm for progress, had tried to convince Caleb that civilization was coming to these mountains, whether he wanted it or not. "You can't hide from the world forever," the engineer had said. Caleb had replied, "I'm not hiding. I'm just done with it." The engineer hadn't understood, but Caleb hadn't expected him to. A man had to lose everything before he could understand why someone might choose nothing. The wooden box on his table held the last tangible pieces of his former life. Inside was his commission letter, signed by the territorial governor. A lock of blonde hair tied with a faded blue ribbon, all that remained of his daughter. A small daguerreotype of Margaret, her face serious in the way people looked in photographs, but he remembered her smile. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, letters. He'd written them in those first months of grief, addressed to Margaret, trying to explain his decision to leave, to isolate himself, to give up on the life they'd planned together. He'd never sent them, never even reread them, but he kept them, just as he kept the box on the table where he could see it. A reminder of what he'd had and what he'd lost. A reminder of why he stayed alone. The coffee had gone cold. Caleb stood, poured it out, and began preparing his breakfast. Cornmeal mush with a bit of dried venison mixed in. While it cooked, he checked his supplies. The winter had been harsh so far, but he'd prepared well. He had enough food to last until spring, enough wood stacked outside to keep the fire burning, enough ammunition if he needed to hunt. This was his life now, predictable, solitary, safe. He was eating his breakfast when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind. The sound was faint, distant, almost lost in the constant whisper of wind through the pines. But something about it made him pause, spoon halfway to his mouth. He set the bowl down and listened. There it was again, not wind, something else. Caleb rose from the table and moved to the door, opening it to the cold morning air. The sound was clearer now, carried on the wind from down the mountain. It was rhythmic, irregular, like something moving through deep snow, something struggling, He stepped out onto the porch, his breath clouding in front of him. The mountains were silent except for that sound, growing slowly closer. His hand moved instinctively to his belt where his knife hung. Old habits, old instincts, rising up from places he thought he'd buried. The sound resolved into footsteps. Labored, desperate footsteps crunching through snow. Someone was coming up the mountain toward his cabin. Caleb's jaw tightened. In 15 years, no one had come to his door uninvited. The few travelers who passed through his territory knew enough to give the hermit a wide berth. Anyone coming here now, in the deep of winter, had to be lost or desperate, or running from something. He went back inside, strapped on his gun belt, and grabbed his rifle from beside the door. Not because he intended violence, but because a man didn't survive 15 winters alone in the mountains by being careless. He returned to the porch and waited. The figure emerged from the tree line a minute later, small, struggling through snow that came past their knees. Caleb's eyes narrowed. A child. A girl, maybe 12 or 13, wearing a coat too thin for this weather. She was carrying something wrapped in blankets against her chest. She stumbled, fell to her hands and knees, struggled up again. Even from this distance, Caleb could see she was at the end of her strength. She took 3 more steps and fell again, this time staying down. For a moment, Caleb stood frozen. Every instinct he'd cultivated for 15 years told him to go back inside, bar the door, let the world handle its own problems. Getting involved meant opening himself up to complications, to connections, to the possibility of loss. But then the bundle in her arms moved, and he heard a sound that cut through 15 years of carefully constructed isolation like a bullet through glass. A baby's cry. His feet were moving before his mind had decided. He crossed the clearing in long strides, his boots punching through the snow crust. The girl heard him coming and tried to rise again, her face desperate and frightened. "Please," she gasped. "Please, you have to help." Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground, taking the weight of both her and the infant wrapped against her chest. The baby's cry intensified, thin and desperate in the cold air. "I've got you," Caleb heard himself say. "You're safe now." The words surprised him. He hadn't used them in 15 years, hadn't even thought them, but they came naturally, automatically, from some part of himself he'd thought was dead and buried with his family. He gathered both children, because that's what they were, both of them children, into his arms and carried them toward the cabin. The baby's crying cut through the mountain silence. The girl was barely conscious, murmuring something he couldn't make out. At the threshold of his cabin, Caleb Stone hesitated for just a moment. He understood, with the clarity that comes in moments of decision, that everything was about to change. If he crossed this threshold with these children, his isolation was over. His carefully constructed life of solitude and safety would be shattered. The baby cried again, and the girl's lips formed a single word: brother. Caleb stepped inside and kicked the door shut against the cold. Caleb laid the girl on his bed and unwrapped the bundle from her arms. The infant inside was perhaps 8 months old, a boy with fine blonde hair and blue eyes wide with fear and cold. His lips had a faint blue tinge that Caleb recognized immediately as the early stages of exposure. He worked quickly, stripping off the baby's damp clothes and wrapping him in the dry bearskin from the bed. He held the child close to the fire, rubbing the small limbs gently to encourage circulation. The baby's crying subsided to whimpers, then to silence as warmth began to seep back into his body. The girl was in worse shape. Her hands and feet were white with frostbite, her breathing shallow and rapid. Caleb removed her wet coat and boots, wrapped her in blankets and propped her near the fire. He knew the dangers of warming someone too quickly, so he worked methodically, checking her pulse, watching her breathing. He prepared a weak broth from venison stock and tried to get some of the warm liquid into her. She swallowed reflexively, coughed, swallowed again. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Where?" she whispered. "You're safe," Caleb said. "You're in my cabin. You both are." Her eyes found the baby. now quiet and warm in his makeshift nest by the fire. Something like relief crossed her face before fear replaced it. "My brother," she said, trying to sit up. "Jacob, they're going to kill him." "Easy now," Caleb said, pressing her gently back down. "You're not going anywhere until you're warm and fed. Then you can tell me what happened. There's no time. There's always time to not die of cold," Caleb said firmly. "Your baby brother is warm and safe. You will be too. Then we'll talk about the rest." She studied his face, and he saw her making a decision. She was young, but her eyes held an old wariness. She'd learned not to trust easily. Finally, she nodded and lay back. Over the next hour, Caleb tended to both children with a competence that surprised him. He'd treated wounded men in his cavalry days, but this was different. These were children, fragile and dependent in a way that made something in his chest tighten. He fed the girls small amounts of broth and bread. He changed the baby's wrappings and discovered the child was wearing several layers, as if someone had dressed him for a long journey. When the girl's color had returned and she could sit up without trembling, Caleb pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she said. "Emma Holloway. This is my baby brother Thomas. I'm Caleb Stone, and I need you to tell me what happened, Emma. All of it." She looked down at her hands, now bandaged where the frostbite had been worst. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "They killed my father 4 days ago. Shot him in front of our house." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "Who did?" "Garrett Pike and his men. They wanted our land. They've wanted it for months, kept making offers, kept threatening. Papa wouldn't sell, said it was our future, mine and Jacob's and Thomas's. Said Mama would have wanted us to keep it." "Your mother?" "She died having Thomas. Last spring." Emma's voice wavered but held. "Papa did his best, raising us alone. But Pike just kept coming back, kept pushing. Then 4 days ago, he rode up with 6 men. Told Papa this was his last chance. Papa said no, so Pike shot him." The words were simple, direct, but Caleb could hear the weight of horror beneath them. He'd seen men die. He'd killed men himself in battle. But murder, the cold-blooded killing of a man in front of his children, was something different. "Where's Jacob now?" he asked. "Hiding. There's an old mine on our property back in the hills. Papa showed it to us once, said if there was ever trouble we should go there. After Pike shot Papa, Jacob grabbed me and Thomas and we ran. We hid in the mine for 2 days. But Jacob said he had to go back, had to try to get the land deed from the house before Pike found it. He made me promise to take Thomas and get help. And you came here." Emma nodded. "People in Pine Ridge talk about you, the mountain man who lives alone up here. They say you were a soldier once. I didn't know where else to go. The neighbors, they're all afraid of Pike. No one would help. I thought maybe—" She stopped, swallowed. "I thought maybe you wouldn't be afraid." Caleb stood and walked to the window. The snow was falling now, soft and steady. He could see his own reflection in the glass, a weathered man looking back at himself with the eyes of someone who'd spent 15 years trying to forget he'd ever been a soldier. "How far to this mine?" he asked. "Half a day's walk, but that was before the snow. And Jacob's hurt. One of Pike's men shot at him when we ran. The bullet grazed his shoulder, so he's wounded, alone, and being hunted by 6 armed men who've already killed once. 5 men now," Emma said quietly. "Jacob shot one of them when they came to the mine. That's why he made me leave. He said they'd be even more determined after that, and at least if I got away with Thomas, part of the family would survive." She pulled something from her pocket, holding it out to Caleb. It was a ribbon, torn and dirty but still bright blue. "Mama gave me this before she died. Told me to always remember that family takes care of family, no matter what. I wore it every day since. But when I left Jacob, I wanted to leave it with him, something to remember us by if—" Her voice broke. "He wouldn't take it. Said I should keep it and bring it back to him when I came home with help." Caleb took the ribbon, felt its weight in his hand. Such a small thing, representing such enormous hope. He thought of the lock of blonde hair in his wooden box, the last tangible piece of his daughter. Some things became precious not because of what they were, but because of what they meant. "Mr. Stone," Emma said, and there was steel in her young voice now. "I walked for 2 days through snow carrying my baby brother because I had nowhere else to go and no one else to ask. I know you don't know us. I know you've got no reason to help. But Jacob is 16 years old, and he's alone and hurt, and those men will kill him. He's all the family I have left except Thomas. So I'm begging you, please, save my brother." Caleb looked at her, this girl barely into her teens, who'd carried an infant through a blizzard to find help, who'd had the courage to do what none of the adults in Pine Ridge would do, who stood in his cabin wearing his bandages and still had the strength to beg for her brother's life. Every instinct told him to say no, to give her food and shelter, maybe point her toward the territorial marshal 3 days' ride east, but to stay out of it himself. He'd given up the life of protecting others. He'd resigned that commission 15 years ago, along with everything else, but when he looked at Emma's face, he saw his own daughter's determination. When he heard Thomas make a small sound by the fire, he heard the echo of the family he'd lost. And when he thought of a 16-year-old boy alone and wounded in a mine, waiting for either rescue or death, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. He thought of the wooden box on his table, of Margaret's face in the daguerreotype, of the life he'd chosen to leave behind. And he realized that maybe you could run from your past, but you couldn't run from who you were at the core. "How many men did you say?" he asked. Emma's eyes widened. 5 now. "But Pike is the worst. I know what he is," Caleb said quietly. He'd known men like Garrett Pike in his cavalry days. Men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who stood in their way. Men who understood only strength and force. He walked to the fireplace and reached up, lifting the cavalry saber from its pegs. The blade caught the firelight, still sharp despite 15 years of neglect. He held it, feeling the familiar weight, the balance. It fit his hand like it had never left. "I'll bring your brother back," he said, and he watched hope bloom in Emma's eyes like a flower in snow. "But after that, you're on your own. I'll get him to safety, but then I'm done. You understand?" Emma nodded, too overcome to speak. Caleb turned away, already running through what he'd need. Weapons, ammunition, food, rope, medical supplies. He'd have to travel light and fast. The snow would slow him down, but it would also make tracking easier. He could follow Emma's trail backward to the mine. He looked at the baby, sleeping by the fire, at the girl on his bed with her torn blue ribbon clutched in her bandaged hands. And he felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart 15 years ago. He'd told himself he was doing this out of simple human decency, that any man would help children in danger. But deep down, in a place he hadn't examined in a long time, he knew the truth. He was doing this because he'd failed to save his own family, and maybe, just maybe, he could save someone else's. "Rest now," he told Emma. "I leave at first light." As he began gathering his supplies, he didn't notice the wooden box on the table, still closed, still holding its memories. But he felt its weight all the same, pressing on him like a hand on his shoulder, reminding him of promises made and broken, of duties left unfinished, of the man he used to be before grief taught him to hide. The night passed slowly. Caleb worked by firelight, preparing for a journey he'd sworn never to make again. He cleaned his weapons with the methodical care of a man who understood that in the wilderness your tools meant the difference between life and death. The cavalry saber received special attention. He sharpened it on his whetstone, the rhythmic scrape filling the cabin with a sound he hadn't heard in 15 years. Emma slept fitfully, occasionally crying out in her sleep. Each time, Caleb would check on her, adjusting her blankets or adding wood to the fire. Thomas woke twice, hungry and confused. Caleb warmed goat's milk he kept for emergencies and fed the baby with a patience that surprised him. The child's small hand wrapped around his finger as he drank, and Caleb felt something twist in his chest. By the time grey light began seeping through the window, he was ready. His rifle was loaded and cleaned, his revolver checked and holstered. He'd packed a saddlebag with dried meat, hardtack, ammunition, rope, and medical supplies. The cavalry saber hung from his belt, its weight familiar and strange at the same time. Emma was awake when he came to check on her one last time. Her eyes were clearer this morning, though dark circles shadowed them. "You're really going," she said. "It wasn't a question. I gave you my word." Caleb knelt beside the bed. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the mine. Every detail. The approach, the terrain, where Pike's men might be positioned." Emma sat up, wincing at the pain in her frostbitten feet. "The mine is in a ravine on the north side of our property. There's only one main approach, through a narrow gap in the rocks. But there's a game trail that comes in from the east. Harder to follow, but it would put you above the mine entrance." "Good. What about cover? Places to watch from?" "There's a ridge about 200 yards out. Lots of boulders and scrub pine. That's where Jacob shot their man from." Caleb nodded, filing away the information. "Pike's men. What can you tell me about them?" "They're ranch hands mostly. Ben Pike hired after he came to the valley last year. They do whatever he tells them. The one Jacob shot was named Dawson. He was the meanest of them, always looking for a fight." She paused. "The others are scared of Pike. You can see it in their faces when he gives orders." "Scared men are dangerous," Caleb said. "They'll do things they wouldn't normally do just to stay in his good graces." He stood, adjusting his gun belt. "I'm going to bar the door when I leave. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more. That's how you'll know it's safe. How long will you be gone?" "If everything goes right, 2 days. 3 at most." He didn't add what they both knew, that if things went wrong he might not come back at all. Emma reached out and caught his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she whispered. "For not turning us away." Caleb looked down at her, this brave girl who'd walked through hell to save her brother. "You did the hard part," he said. "You got here. You survived. Now take care of your brother and trust me to do what needs doing." He gently pulled his hand free and went to where Thomas slept by the fire. The baby was warm and peaceful, one small fist curled against his cheek. Caleb stood looking down at him for a long moment, remembering another child, another time. Then he turned away before the memories could take hold. At the door, he paused and looked back at the cabin. Emma was watching him with those old young eyes. The fire crackled. The wooden box sat on the table, silent and waiting. This room had been his entire world for 15 years, and now he was walking away from it toward violence and danger and all the things he'd promised himself he'd left behind. "Bar the door," he said again. Then he stepped out into the cold dawn. Sable was ready, saddled and impatient to move. Caleb swung up into the saddle, feeling the familiar rhythm of it, the muscle memory that never quite left. He'd ridden more miles than he could count in his cavalry days, across territories most men only heard about in stories. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving fresh powder over the old drifts. Emma's trail from yesterday was still visible, a struggling line of deep footprints heading down the mountain. Caleb pointed Sable toward it and gave her her head. The descent was treacherous. The mare picked her way carefully through snow that sometimes came up to her chest. Caleb let his body move with her rhythm, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Old habits were returning, skills he'd thought forgotten. He found himself cataloguing sightlines, cover positions, ambush points. The soldier in him was waking up. They'd been traveling for about an hour when he saw the first sign that Emma's journey had been even more desperate than he'd realized. A depression in the snow where she'd fallen and rested. And there, on a branch, a scrap of fabric from her coat, torn off as she'd pulled herself upright. The girl had been operating on pure determination by this point, every step a small victory against cold and exhaustion. Caleb felt a surge of admiration. He'd led grown men who would have given up in less dire circumstances. Emma Holloway had the kind of courage that couldn't be taught. By midday, he descended below the snow line into the foothills. The terrain here was different, more open, with scattered stands of pine and rocky outcroppings. He could see for miles in every direction, which meant anyone watching could see him too. He dismounted and led Sable, using the available cover, moving carefully. He found where Emma had spent her first night, huddled in a shallow cave, barely big enough for her and the baby. There were signs she'd tried to make a fire, but couldn't get it started with her frozen hands. The thought of her crouched here in the dark, holding Thomas and listening to him cry, made Caleb's jaw tighten. "You're a tough one, Emma Holloway," he said quietly to the empty cave. "Your mother would be proud," he pressed on. The trail led down into a valley where a thin line of smoke rose from distant buildings. That would be the Holloway homestead. Caleb studied it through his old field glasses, a habit from his scouting days. He could make out a house, a barn, some outbuildings, and there 3 horses tied out front. Pike's men were still there, probably searching for the land deed. Caleb gave the homestead a wide berth, circling to the north. According to Emma, the mine was in the hills, on the far side of the property. He'd have to approach carefully. Pike would have men watching. The sun was beginning its descent when Caleb spotted movement ahead. He immediately pulled Sable into a stand of pines and dismounted, watching. 2 riders were moving along the base of the hills, searching systematically. They were well armed and alert. Caleb tied Sable deep in the trees and moved forward on foot, using cover the way he'd taught countless young soldiers to do. He got close enough to hear their conversation carried on the winter air. "Been 3 days. Kid's probably dead already." "Pike don't think so. Says the boy's tougher than he looks. And we need to be sure. Can't leave no witnesses. Should have just burned them all out to start with. Pike wanted to do it legal at first. Offer and refuse, all proper-like. Ain't his fault the old man was stubborn," the first man spat. "Well, he ain't stubborn no more. And once we find the boy, the land's ours clear." They rode on, disappearing around a rocky shoulder. Caleb waited until they were well gone, then moved in the direction they'd come from. If they were searching this area, the mine couldn't be far. He found it 20 minutes later. A dark opening in the hillside, partially hidden by scrub and fallen rock. The ravine Emma had described, and there, on the ridge above it, exactly where she'd said, a good vantage point among the boulders. Caleb studied the area carefully. There were tracks everywhere, men and horses crisscrossing the ground. Some were old, probably from when the Holloway children had fled here. Others were newer. Pike's men had been here searching, but he also saw signs they'd been careful. No one had gone into the mine itself, at least not recently. They were watching it, waiting for Jacob to come out or make a mistake, which meant the boy might still be alive in there. Caleb settled into a position in the rocks and waited for dark. Patience was a skill he'd learned long ago and never forgotten. The sun sank lower, painting the hills gold and red. Shadows stretched and merged, and Caleb Stone, who'd spent 15 years alone on a mountain, prepared to step back into a world of violence he'd thought he'd left behind. He touched the cavalry saber at his belt, feeling its cold metal through his glove. Above him, the first stars were appearing in a darkening sky, somewhere in the mine ahead. A boy was waiting, hoping, maybe praying. Caleb meant to make sure those prayers got answered. Full darkness brought a cold that settled deep into the bones. Caleb waited in his rocky perch, watching the mine entrance and the surrounding terrain. His breath came in small controlled puffs that he was careful to minimize. In his cavalry days, he'd learned that on a quiet night, even breathing could give away a position. 2 more riders appeared just after sunset, joining the patrol pattern. That made 4 men he'd identified, which meant there was at least 1 more somewhere, probably with Pike himself. The men were systematic, but not particularly skilled. They rode the same routes, checked the same positions. Caleb could have slipped past them easily, but first he needed to know what had happened to the boy's father. Emma had said he was shot at their homestead, but Caleb needed to see for himself. Bodies told stories if you knew how to read them. And something about Emma's account had stuck in his mind. Pike had wanted to do it legal at first. Men like Pike didn't bother with legality unless there was something to be gained from it. When the patrol riders moved off to the far end of their circuit, Caleb descended from his position and made his way toward the Holloway homestead. He moved like a ghost through the darkness, using every bit of cover, stopping frequently to listen. The skills came back so naturally, it was as if 15 years had evaporated like morning fog. The homestead was dark when he reached it. The horses he'd seen earlier were gone. probably back to wherever Pike kept his men housed. Caleb circled the property twice before approaching, making sure it was truly empty. Then he moved in. The house door hung open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. Caleb slipped inside, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness. When they did, he saw the chaos of a search. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, floorboards pried up. They were looking for something. The land deed, most likely. He found the body behind the house, partially covered by snow that had fallen since the killing. Caleb knelt beside it, brushing away the snow with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who'd seen him. The man had been shot twice, both times in the chest. Close range, judging by the powder burns visible even in the starlight. The killer had wanted to be sure. The dead man's face was peaceful, despite the violence of his death. He looked to be in his 40s, weathered by hard work and sun. His hands were calloused, a workingman's hands that had held his children, built his home, worked his land. Caleb searched the body carefully. The pockets had already been turned out, but he found something the searchers had missed. Clutched in the dead man's right hand, hidden beneath the body, was a pocket watch. The crystal was cracked, and there was blood on the gold case, but when Caleb held it to his ear, he could hear it still ticking. He opened it. Inside the case was an inscription, "To James, with love eternal, Sarah," and tucked behind the mechanism a small photograph of a woman holding a baby. The woman had kind eyes and a gentle smile. Sarah Holloway, who died bringing Thomas into the world. Caleb felt something hard and cold settle in his chest. This watch represented everything these people had fought for: family, future, hope. And Pike had snuffed it out with 2 bullets because he wanted land. He slipped the watch into his pocket. The children would want it, proof their father had fought to the end, evidence of what had been taken from them. As he turned to leave, something else caught his eye. Scratched into the frozen ground beside the body, barely visible, were letters. James Holloway had used his last moments to write something. Caleb struck a match, cupping it carefully, and read the words, "Deed in wall, so the father had hidden it, and died trying to leave a message about where." Caleb extinguished the match and looked back at the house. If the deed was still there, if Pike's men hadn't found it, that piece of paper might be the only thing keeping Jacob alive. Pike needed that deed to make his claim legal. Until he had it, he couldn't risk leaving witnesses. Caleb returned to the house and began a more careful search. The walls had been punched full of holes, where Pike's men had checked for hiding places, but they'd done it haphazardly, without system. Caleb worked methodically, section by section, tapping and listening. He found it in the bedroom, behind a board that had been carefully cut and fitted back into place. So carefully that even knowing it was there, it took him 10 minutes to locate the right section. Inside the hollow space was an oilskin packet. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside was the land deed, legal and proper, signed and witnessed. 160 acres, including mineral rights and water access. He understood immediately why Pike wanted it so badly. This land was worth a fortune to the right buyer. But there was more in the packet. Letters from the land office, a survey map, and Caleb felt his blood run cold, a wanted poster. The face on the poster was labeled Clayton Garrett, and the charges included murder, theft, and fraud across 2 territories. The reward was $500. The man Emma knew as Garrett Pike was already a wanted killer, operating under a false name. Caleb stared at the poster in the dim light filtering through the window. This changed everything. Pike wasn't just a land grabber. He was a fugitive who'd recreated himself in this valley. If his real identity became known, he'd hang, which meant he couldn't afford to leave any witnesses at all. Jacob Holloway wasn't just in danger. He was as good as dead if Pike found him. Caleb carefully repacked the oilskin and tucked it inside his coat. Then he erased all signs of his presence and slipped back out into the night. He had what he'd come for, but the knowledge sat heavy in his gut. This wasn't going to end with a simple rescue. Pike would hunt these children to the ends of the earth to protect his secret. The return trip to the mine area took him an hour of careful movement. The patrols had changed, fresh men replacing the earlier riders. These were more alert, more thorough. Caleb had to use every trick he knew to avoid detection. He finally reached his earlier position in the rocks as the night deepened toward its darkest hour. Below him, the mine entrance was a black mouth in the hillside. No light showed from within, but Caleb's instincts told him Jacob was in there somewhere, hurt and scared and running out of time. The question was how to reach him without alerting Pike's men. Caleb studied the terrain, running through possibilities. A frontal approach was suicide. The mine entrance was exposed, easily watched. But Emma had mentioned the mine had been worked years ago. Old mines often had multiple entrances, ventilation shafts, collapsed sections that created new openings. He needed to scout the area properly, and he needed to do it without being seen, as he considered his options. One of the patrol riders passed close enough that Caleb could hear him muttering to himself about the cold. The man was young, probably no more than 25, and clearly unhappy with his assignment. He kept looking back toward where the lights of town would be, as if wishing he were there instead of here. An idea formed in Caleb's mind. It was risky, but everything about this situation was risky. The patrol patterns were regular, predictable. There was a gap of about 15 minutes between passes. If he timed it right, he could use that gap. But first, he needed to know more about the mine's layout. He needed to talk to someone who knew this area. And there was only one person available. Caleb waited until the young rider made his next pass, then followed him at a distance. The man rode to a sheltered spot near some trees, dismounted, and proceeded to relieve himself while his horse cropped at exposed grass. It was the opening Caleb needed. He moved in absolute silence, crossing the open ground in a crouch. The young man never heard him coming. Caleb's hand closed over his mouth as his other arm went around his throat in a controlled hold. The man struggled briefly, then went limp as the blood flow to his brain was restricted. Caleb lowered him gently to the ground, then quickly bound his hands and feet with rope from his own pack. He stuffed a gag in the man's mouth and waited for him to regain consciousness. It didn't take long. The young rider's eyes opened, went wide with fear when he saw Caleb's face hovering over him in the starlight. "I'm going to ask you questions," Caleb said quietly. "You're going to answer them. If you lie to me, I'll know. If you try to call out, I'll make sure you regret it. But if you tell me the truth, I'll let you live." "Nod if you understand." The young man nodded frantically. Caleb pulled the gag down slightly. "How many men does Pike have watching this mine?" "5 of us," the man whispered. 2 on patrol, 2 resting in camp, 1 with Pike in town. Where's the camp?" "Quarter-mile south, in a draw by the creek. The boy in the mine. Is he still alive?" "We think so. Pike says we're to starve him out. He's got to come out eventually. How long has it been since anyone saw him?" 2 days. "We hear movement sometimes, deeper in the mine. But he won't answer when we call to him." Caleb nodded slowly. The boy was smart, staying deep and staying quiet. But he was also trapped, and time was running out. "One more question," Caleb said. "Is there another way into that mine?" The young man hesitated, and Caleb saw knowledge in his eyes. "Answer me," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a tone that had once made hardened soldiers jump to obey. "There's an old air shaft," the man admitted, "about 100 yards west of the main entrance. It's supposed to be collapsed, but you're not sure," Caleb finished. The man nodded. Caleb studied him for a moment. He could see the man wasn't a killer at heart, just someone who'd made bad choices and found himself in over his head. The kind of man who'd follow orders, but wouldn't seek violence for its own sake. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. Billy Mathers." "Well, Billy, you're going to stay here nice and quiet until morning. By then, I'll either be long gone or dead. Either way, your part in this is over. You understand?" Billy nodded again, relief evident in his face. Caleb replaced the gag and checked the bindings. They'd hold until morning, but weren't tight enough to cause permanent harm. Then he took Billy's horse, mounted up, and rode toward the western end of the ravine. The pocket watch in his coat seemed to tick louder with each step, counting down the seconds until dawn, until discovery, until violence became inevitable. The airshaft was exactly where Billy had said it would be, hidden behind an outcropping of rock and overgrown with scrub brush. Caleb dismounted and examined it carefully. The opening was narrow, maybe 3 feet across, and dropped down into darkness. He couldn't tell how deep it went, or if it was truly passable. He had rope, but going down blind into an abandoned mine shaft was the kind of decision that got men killed. Still, the alternative was trying to reach Jacob through the main entrance, which was under constant watch. At least this way he had a chance. Caleb secured the rope to a sturdy pine and tested it with his full weight. Satisfied, he lit a candle stub from his pack and lowered it into the shaft on a string. The flame stayed steady, which meant there was air circulation. That was a good sign. It meant the shaft connected to the main tunnels and wasn't just a dead end. He pulled up the candle, extinguished it, and began his descent into the darkness. The shaft was tight, scraping his shoulders as he lowered himself hand over hand. Loose rock crumbled under his boots, falling away into the black below. He counted his progress by arm lengths, trying to judge how deep he'd gone. 20 feet, 30, 40, his boots finally hit solid ground at what he estimated was about 50 feet down. He descended into a narrow tunnel, the walls rough-hewn rock that showed the marks of old tools. The air was cold and damp, smelling of earth and stone and the peculiar metallic scent of mineral deposits. Caleb took out his candle again and lit it, shielding the flame with his hand. The tunnels stretched away in both directions, disappearing into darkness. He oriented himself as best he could, trying to remember the position of the main entrance relative to where he'd descended. If his sense of direction was right, the main tunnel should be to his left. He moved slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight down. Old mines were death traps, even when they'd been properly maintained, and this one had been abandoned for years. Timbers sagged under the weight of earth above. In places, sections of the ceiling had partially collapsed, forcing him to crawl over piles of rubble. The silence was absolute, except for his own breathing and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the darkness. He'd been underground maybe 20 minutes when he heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to the mine itself. Caleb froze, every sense straining. There it was again, a scraping sound like boot leather on stone. Someone was ahead of him in the darkness, moving slowly and carefully. He extinguished his candle immediately, plunging himself into blackness so complete it felt solid. His hand moved to the revolver at his hip, drawing it slowly to avoid any sound. He controlled his breathing, making it shallow and silent. The scraping came again, closer now. Then a new sound, labored breathing, the kind that came from pain or exhaustion or both. A faint glow appeared in the tunnel ahead, the dim light of what looked like a makeshift torch or candle. Caleb pressed himself against the tunnel wall and waited. The light grew stronger, and with it came the shape of a person. Young, thin, moving with the careful steps of someone navigating familiar but dangerous ground. The figure carried an old rifle in one hand and held a burning brand of twisted cloth in the other. "Jacob Holloway," Caleb said quietly. The boy spun around, bringing the rifle up with surprising speed despite his obvious exhaustion. His face was gaunt, streaked with dirt, and his left shoulder was wrapped in what looked like a torn shirt, darkened with old blood. His eyes were wild with fear and desperation. "Don't move," Jacob said, his voice cracking. "I'll shoot." "I swear I will. Your sister sent me," Caleb said, keeping his hands visible. "Emma? She's safe at my cabin with your baby brother?" Jacob's rifle wavered slightly. "You're lying." "Emma wouldn't. How do I know you're not one of Pike's men?" "Because Pike's men would have shot you already, instead of talking." Caleb slowly reached into his coat. "I'm going to show you something. Don't shoot me for it." He pulled out the blue ribbon, holding it so the light caught it. "Emma wore this in her hair when she came to me. She said your mother gave it to her. Said to remember that family takes care of family." The rifle lowered a fraction. Jacob's eyes fixed on the ribbon, and Caleb saw the boy's throat work as he swallowed hard. "She really made it." His voice was barely a whisper, through 2 days of blizzard, carrying Thomas the whole way. "She's got more courage than most men I've known." Caleb took a careful step forward. And I gave her my word I'd bring you back to her. So I'm asking you to trust me, son. Let me help you." Jacob stood frozen for a long moment, the rifle still half raised, clearly torn between hope and the caution that had kept him alive this long. Finally, the weapon dropped completely, and the boy's legs seemed to give out. He sank to the ground, the makeshift torch falling from his hand. Caleb moved quickly, catching the torch before it could start a fire and kneeling beside the boy. Up close, he could see Jacob was in worse shape than he'd first appeared. The shoulder wound was infected, the flesh around it hot and red. The boy's forehead was burning with fever. "How long since you've eaten?" Caleb asked, already pulling dried meat and hardtack from his pack. "I don't know." 2 days? 3? Jacob took the food with shaking hands and ate like a starving animal, barely chewing. "I had some supplies when we first came here, but they ran out. I've been drinking water that seeps through the rocks, but there's no food. I was going to have to try to slip past Pike's men tonight or die in here. Well, you're not doing either now." Caleb examined the shoulder wound by the light of the torch. The bullet had grazed deep, tearing a furrow through muscle. It needed proper cleaning and stitching, but that would have to wait. "This is infected. We need to get you out of here and get you proper treatment. They're watching the entrance. I've tried 3 times to leave. Each time they were there waiting." "I know. I came in through an old air shaft." Caleb pulled out his canteen and made Jacob drink slowly. "But we're not leaving the way I came in. Too risky in your condition." "Then how?" "First, I need to see what you know about this mine. Your father must have explored it before. Did he leave any maps? Any notes?" Jacob's eyes widened. He reached into his own coat with his good hand and pulled out a worn leather journal, its cover stained and water-damaged. He kept this. Wrote in it almost every day. There's stuff about the land, about his plans for the future. And yes, there are sketches of the mine in the back. He thought maybe someday we could work it again if the prices were right. Caleb took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of it. This was a father's legacy, his thoughts and dreams preserved in ink and paper. He opened it to the back pages and found what he was looking for: detailed sketches of the mine layout, including multiple entrances and a notation about structural weaknesses. But as he flipped through the earlier pages, something else caught his attention. Recent entries, written in the weeks before James Holloway's death. They detailed Pike's increasingly aggressive offers for the land. They documented threats, intimidation, even sabotage of equipment and livestock. "Your father knew Pike was going to move against him," Caleb said quietly. "He tried to get the law involved. Rode to the territorial marshal's office twice. But Pike had friends there, people he'd paid off. They said it was just a business dispute, nothing criminal." Jacob's voice was bitter. "Pa said the law only worked if the people enforcing it were honest." Caleb nodded grimly. It was a truth he'd learned in his cavalry days. Justice was only as strong as the people sworn to uphold it. He turned to a page near the end of the journal. James Holloway had written, "If anything happens to me, the children must know the truth about this land. It's not just valuable for timber or grazing." The survey I had done last month confirmed significant mineral deposits: gold, silver, possibly copper. Pike knows this. He's seen the survey report somehow. That's why he won't give up. This land could make a man rich beyond dreaming. But it's not about money for me. It's about giving my children a future, a legacy from their mother and me. If I die fighting for that, at least I'll die knowing I tried to protect what's theirs by right. The words hit Caleb hard. Here was a man who'd known death was coming and had faced it anyway, because protecting his children's future mattered more than his own safety. It was the kind of courage Caleb had once valued above all else, before his own losses had taught him that safety was better than valor. But looking at Jacob's feverish face, at the journal filled with a dead father's hopes, Caleb felt something shift inside him. James Holloway had died trying to protect his family's future. Emma had walked through a blizzard to save her brother. And Jacob had stayed in this cold, dark hole, wounded and starving, rather than surrender. These children had more courage than most men Caleb had known. "Your father was a good man," Caleb said. "And he'd be proud of what you've done. What you've all done." Jacob's eyes filled with tears. "I should have fought them." When they shot Pa, I should have. You did exactly what your father wanted you to do. You protected your sister and brother. You stayed alive. That took more strength than fighting would have. Caleb handed the journal back. Now we're going to make sure that strength wasn't wasted. We're getting you out of here. He studied the mine sketches again, formulating a plan. The main entrance was too well watched. The air shaft he'd come down was too difficult for Jacob in his condition. But there was another possibility marked on the map, a collapsed section that had created a new opening on the far side of the hill. Can you walk? Caleb asked. I'll crawl if I have to. That's what I wanted to hear. Caleb helped the boy to his feet, supporting his weight. We're going to move slow and quiet. If we run into any of Pike's men down here, stay behind me, and don't hesitate when I tell you to do something. Understood? Jacob nodded. They started moving deeper into the mine, following the map sketched in the journal. The tunnels wound through the earth like the burrows of some great animal, branching and reconnecting in ways that would have been hopelessly confusing without the map. In some places, they had to squeeze through gaps where the ceiling had sagged. In others, they waded through ankle-deep water that had pooled from underground seeps. All the while, Caleb listened for sounds of pursuit. Billy Mathers would be found eventually, and when he was, Pike's men would know someone was here. The clock was ticking. They'd been moving for perhaps 30 minutes when Jacob suddenly grabbed Caleb's arm. Listen, he whispered. Caleb heard it, voices echoing through the tunnels from somewhere behind them. Pike's men had entered the mine. They were searching, calling out to each other as they spread through the passages. How many entrances do they know about? Caleb asked quietly. Just the main one, as far as I know. But they'll find our tracks in the dust. Caleb looked down. Jacob was right. Their passage through the tunnels had left clear prints in the accumulated dirt. Even in the dim light, anyone following would see where they'd gone. He made a quick decision. We need to split up. What? No, I'm not. Listen to me. Caleb gripped the boy's good shoulder. You take the route to that collapsed section. It's marked clearly on the map. Get out. Circle around to where I tied a horse near the air shaft, and ride hard for my cabin. You know where it is. Emma's trail in the snow will still be visible enough to follow. What are you going to do? I'm going to lead them away from you. Make them think you're still alone down here. Caleb pulled the oilskin packet from his coat and handed it to Jacob. This is your father's land deed, and some other papers you're going to need. Keep it safe. And this, he pulled out the pocket watch. Your father was holding this when he died. He wanted you to have it. Jacob took the watch with shaking hands, opening it to see his mother's picture. His face crumpled, but he held himself together through sheer force of will. Go, Caleb said. Don't look back, don't wait for me. Just get to safety and trust that I know what I'm doing. But your sister asked me to save you. I'm keeping that promise. Now move. Jacob hesitated one more moment, then nodded and disappeared into the darkness, moving as quietly as his injuries allowed. Caleb watched him go, then deliberately scuffed his boots in the dirt, leaving fresh tracks heading in a different direction. The voices were getting closer. Caleb moved toward them, away from Jacob's escape route, making just enough noise to be tracked. He was drawing them in, and they were following. Caleb led them deeper into the mine, using every trick he knew to stay just ahead of pursuit. He'd leave clear signs in one direction, then double back and take another tunnel. He'd knock over support timbers to create obstacles. Once he even fired a shot into the darkness behind him, the muzzle flash and report echoing through the tunnels like thunder, sending Pike's men scrambling for cover while he slipped away, but he was also working his way toward his own exit. The mine map showed a passage that led to a natural cave system, which in turn opened onto the mountainside well away from the main entrance. It was risky. The passage was marked as partially collapsed, but it was his best chance. He could hear Pike's men spreading through the tunnels, getting organized now. They'd realized they were chasing someone more dangerous than a wounded boy. Their voices had lost their casual confidence and taken on a wary edge. Who the hell is down here? One of them called out. Doesn't matter, another voice responded. Pike said no witnesses. That means whoever it is dies in here. Caleb kept moving. The passage to the cave system should be just ahead, according to the map. He rounded a corner and found it, a narrow opening half filled with rubble. Beyond it, he could see natural rock formations instead of hewn walls. The cave system. He squeezed through the gap, pulling himself over loose rock that shifted treacherously beneath him. Halfway through, his coat caught on something. He heard fabric tear as he wrenched himself free. Behind him, the voices were getting closer. They'd heard the noise. Over here! He went this way. Caleb emerged into a larger space, a natural cavern formed by water over countless years. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone icicles. His torch reflected off wet rock surfaces, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. He could see multiple openings leading away in different directions. He chose the one that seemed to slope upward, reasoning that it would eventually lead to the surface. The going was treacherous. The cave floor was slick with moisture and uneven with formations that had to be climbed over or around. More than once, he had to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for his shoulders. Behind him, he heard Pike's men enter the cavern. There were at least 3 of them, maybe 4. They were spreading out, searching the various passages. Caleb pushed forward, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The passage he'd chosen narrowed, became almost a tunnel again, then suddenly opened into another chamber. And there, blessed sight, was natural light filtering down from above. The opening was perhaps 20 feet up, a crack in the rock face that widened as it reached the surface. It would be a hard climb, but it was possible. Caleb extinguished his torch and began to climb, using the rough rock face for hand and footholds. He'd made it about halfway when he heard someone enter the chamber below. A light appeared, sweeping across the walls. He's climbing! Up there! A gunshot rang out, the bullet striking rock inches from Caleb's hand. He didn't return fire, couldn't afford to lose his grip. Instead, he climbed faster, ignoring the burn in his muscles, focusing only on the next handhold, the next foothold. More shots followed, but shooting upward in dim light wasn't easy. The bullets went wide, sparking off rock around him. Caleb pulled himself up the last few feet and emerged into the grey light of pre-dawn. He was on the mountainside, perhaps a quarter-mile from the main mine entrance. Below him, he could hear Pike's men cursing and arguing about whether to follow. The climb would be difficult for them, especially in the dim light of their torches. Caleb didn't wait to see what they'd decide. He oriented himself and started moving, using the terrain for cover. The horse he'd taken from Billy Mathers should still be tied near the air shaft. If Jacob had followed his instructions, the boy would be there or already gone. The first rays of sunlight were breaking over the eastern peaks when Caleb reached the location. The horse was there, but there was no sign of Jacob. Good. The boy had made it out and was on his way to safety. Caleb untied the horse and swung into the saddle. He needed to get back to his cabin, make sure the children were safe, and then the thought stopped him cold. And then what? He'd promised Emma he'd bring Jacob back, and he would. But after that, he'd told her they'd be on their own. He'd made it clear he was done after the rescue, but things had changed. Pike wasn't just a land grabber. He was a wanted killer, operating under a false name. He had money, influence, and men willing to do violence on his command. Even if Caleb got the children to safety, how long would they stay safe? Pike couldn't afford to let them live. Not with what they knew. The realization settled over Caleb like a weight. This wasn't going to end with a simple rescue. It was going to end with Pike dead or behind bars, or with the children dead. There was no middle ground. He turned the horse toward his cabin, but his mind was already working through possibilities. They needed evidence that would convince the territorial marshal to act, even if Pike had friends in that office. They needed to expose Pike's true identity. They needed... The sound of hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Multiple riders coming fast from the direction of the mine. Pike's men had gotten out and mounted up. They were coming after him. Caleb urged his horse into a gallop, heading for the high country where he had the advantage. The terrain here was his domain. He'd spent 15 years learning every trail, every pass, every hiding place. Pike's men were good riders, but they didn't know this land the way he did. The chase led up into the mountains, through stands of pine and across snow-covered meadows. Caleb could hear them behind him, gaining slightly on the straightaways, but losing ground when the terrain got rough. He led them higher into areas where the air thinned and the cold bit deeper. He needed to lose them completely, get back to his cabin without leading them there. The last thing he wanted was Pike's men finding where he'd hidden the children. Caleb guided his horse into a narrow canyon he knew well, one that seemed to be a dead end, but actually had a passage through if you knew where to look. He slowed as he entered, making sure his pursuers saw him go in. Then he dismounted and led the horse through a gap in the rocks barely wide enough for them to fit. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening up, sometimes narrowing to the point where he had to remove his saddlebags to squeeze through. He could hear Pike's men enter the canyon behind him, their voices echoing off the walls. "He's trapped! The canyon's a dead end! Spread out and find him!" Caleb smiled grimly. Let them search. By the time they figured out the passage existed, he'd be miles away. He emerged from the far end of the canyon and remounted. But instead of heading straight for his cabin, he took a longer route, one that would confuse his trail and make it harder to follow. He crossed streams to hide his tracks, rode over rocky ground that wouldn't hold prints, doubled back several times to check if anyone was still following. By the time the sun was fully up, he was confident he'd lost them. He turned toward home, pushing his tired horse as hard as he dared. The cabin came into view 2 hours later. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin grey line against the blue sky. Everything looked peaceful, undisturbed. But as Caleb rode closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the snow. Multiple horses, coming from the direction of the valley. They circled the cabin, then headed back the way they'd come. Someone had been here while he was gone. Caleb dismounted and approached carefully, his hand on his revolver. The front door was still barred from the inside, just as he'd instructed Emma to keep it. But there were gouges in the wood frame, as if someone had tried to force it. He knocked the pattern he'd taught her 3 times, paused twice more. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. "Emma, it's Caleb!" "Open up." Still nothing. Caleb's heart was pounding now. He went to the window and peered through. The inside of the cabin was dim, the fire burned down to coals. He could see Emma sitting on the bed, holding Thomas, but she wasn't moving to answer the door. "Emma!" He called through the window. She turned toward his voice and he saw her face. She'd been crying, and she was terrified. "They were here," she said, her voice barely audible through the glass. "Pike's men. They didn't get in, but they know we're here. They said," her voice broke, "they said they'd come back with Pike himself. They said we're all going to die." Before Caleb could respond, he heard something that turned his blood to ice. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming up the trail toward his cabin. And this time, there was no mistaking the sound. These weren't the scattered pursuers he'd led into the mountains. This was an organized group, riding with purpose. Caleb turned and saw them emerging from the tree line. 6 riders spread in a line. And at their center, mounted on a large black horse, was a man who could only be Garrett Pike. Pike reined in about 50 yards from the cabin. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and confident in the saddle. His face was weathered but handsome, with the kind of easy smile that made people trust him right up until he put a knife in their back. He wore expensive clothes and good weapons, the appearance of a successful rancher. But Caleb could see the truth beneath the surface. This was Clayton Garrett, wanted killer. The smile didn't reach his eyes, and those eyes were the cold, flat eyes of a predator. "Well now," Pike called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Looks like we've got ourselves a situation here." Caleb said nothing, just watched and calculated. 6 men, including Pike, all armed. His rifle was in the cabin, but he had his revolver and knife. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse. "I'm going to guess you're the one who's been causing all this trouble," Pike continued. "The one who helped the boy escape. That was impressive work, friend. Real impressive. But it was also real stupid. State your business and move on," Caleb said, his voice steady. "You're on my land," Pike laughed. "Your land? Friend, you're squatting on public territory. You've got no more claim to this spot than I do. But I'm not here to argue property rights. I'm here for those children. See, they've got something that belongs to me, and I aim to get it back. The land deed belongs to them. Their father died for it. Their father died because he was stubborn. I offered him good money, more than fair. He chose to refuse. Pike's smile faded slightly. But that's history now. The way I see it, you got two choices. You can hand over those kids and whatever they took from their father's house, and I'll let you live. Hell, I'll even pay you for your trouble. Or you can try to be a hero, and I'll bury you right here along with them. Caleb looked at the men flanking Pike. They were hard cases, all of them, men who'd chosen this life. But he could also see uncertainty in some of their faces. They'd signed up to intimidate and steal, maybe rough some people up. They hadn't signed up to murder children. Third option, Caleb said. You turn around and ride away. I keep the children safe, and in return, I don't send a wire to the territorial marshal telling him that Clayton Garrett is wanted for murder in 2 territories, and is currently operating under a false name in this valley. The effect was immediate. Pike's smile disappeared completely. His men shifted in their saddles, confused. One of them said, Clayton who? Boss, what's he talking about? Pike's hand moved to his gun, but he didn't draw. Not yet. That's an interesting story, friend. Where'd you hear a thing like that? Found a wanted poster. In the Holloway house. James Holloway knew exactly who you were. That's why you had to kill him, isn't it? Not just for the land. Because he could expose you. You're making a big mistake, Pike said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. A real big mistake. The mistake was yours. You should have left this valley the moment you knew someone had discovered your secret. Instead, you killed a man and orphaned 3 children. Now those children are under my protection. And I'm telling you one last time, ride away while you still can. Pike studied Caleb for a long moment. Then he smiled again, but there was no warmth in it at all. I know who you are too. Asked around about the hermit in the mountains. Captain Caleb Stone, late of the 3rd Cavalry. War hero, respected officer. Then your family died, and you ran away to hide up here. He leaned forward in his saddle. You've been out of the fight for 15 years, Captain. You think you can take on 6 men? You think that rusty sword on your wall is going to save you? I think you should ask Billy Mathers how rusty I am, Caleb said. Oh, wait, you can't, because he's tied up in the woods where I left him. That got a reaction. Pike's jaw tightened. He glanced at his men, doing a quick count, realizing one was missing. Last chance, Caleb said. Right away. Pike's hand dropped to his gun. No, I don't think so. The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. Then everything happened at once. Pike drew his gun, and Caleb dove behind the woodpile as bullets tore through the air where he'd been standing. The cabin window shattered as Pike's men opened fire. Inside, Emma screamed. Caleb came up from behind cover and fired twice, dropping one of Pike's men from his saddle. The others scattered, taking positions behind trees and rocks. Return fire chipped splinters from the logs of the woodpile. Emma, Caleb shouted. Get away from the windows. Get to the corner behind the fireplace. He couldn't hear her response over the gunfire, but he had to trust she'd heard him. He fired again, forcing Pike's men to keep their heads down, then made a run for the cabin. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet. He hit the door hard and wrenched it open, diving inside as more rounds punched through the wood. Emma was huddled in the corner he'd indicated. Thomas clutched to her chest. Both children were terrified but unharmed. Caleb slammed the door and dropped the bar across it. Are you hit? He asked Emma. She shook her head, unable to speak. Caleb grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, carefully keeping to the side. He could see Pike's men taking up positions in a semicircle around the cabin. They had him surrounded and they knew it. We can wait you out. Pike called from behind a tree. You've got maybe a day's worth of water in there, and these kids need to eat. This ends one way or another. Caleb didn't answer, just counted his ammunition. Rifle rounds, revolver rounds, enough for maybe a short fight, but not a siege. Pike was right about that much. Time wasn't on his side, but Pike had made a mistake. He'd assumed Caleb was alone, that Jacob hadn't made it out, which meant the boy was probably still free, still had the evidence that could bring Pike down. All Caleb had to do was keep Emma and Thomas alive long enough for help to arrive. The problem was, help might not arrive in time. Caleb, Emma whispered. I'm sorry. I should have run when they first came. Should have taken Thomas and hidden in the woods. But I was too scared. I just stayed inside like you said, and now you did exactly right," Caleb told her. "You stayed safe and stayed quiet. That's all I asked." He risked a quick look out the window. Pike's men were settling in for a wait. Jacob made it out. "He's got the evidence we need. If we can hold out long enough—" "But we can't," Emma said. "Can we? There's too many of them." Caleb wanted to lie, to give her false hope. But this girl had earned the truth. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm going to do everything I can to keep you and Thomas safe. You understand? Whatever happens to me, you stay in that corner and stay quiet. If they get past me, if—" He stopped, not wanting to voice what came next. Emma's hand found his. "You won't let them." "I know you won't." Her faith in him was almost painful. He'd spent 15 years running from responsibility, from connection, from caring about anything or anyone. And now here he was, trapped in a cabin with 2 children depending on him to save their lives. It was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid, and exactly what he needed. "No," he said quietly. "I won't let them." The siege settled into an uneasy waiting game. Pike's men would occasionally fire a few rounds at the cabin to keep Caleb pinned down, and he'd return fire to remind them he was still dangerous. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow brilliant white and making the shadows stark. Around midday, one of Pike's men tried to work his way closer, using the trees for cover. Caleb waited until the man was committed, then put a bullet close enough to make him scramble back. After that, they kept their distance, but Caleb knew they were just biding their time. Eventually they'd try something, set fire to the cabin maybe, or rush it all at once. Pike was a killer, but he wasn't stupid. He'd wait for the right moment. That moment came sooner than Caleb expected. One of Pike's men came riding back from the direction of the valley, his horse lathered from hard riding. He had something slung over his saddle, something that made Caleb's blood run cold, even before he could see it clearly. It was Jacob. The boy was tied across the saddle, unconscious or worse. The rider had blood on his shirt and a triumphant grin on his face. Found him about 2 miles down the trail. The man called out. Bastard was heading for Pine Ridge. Must have been planning to bring the law back. Caleb's hands tightened on his rifle. Jacob had been free. Had been safe. And now, well now, Pike said, his voice carrying satisfaction. Looks like we've got ourselves some leverage. Stone, you hearing this? We've got the boy, and if you don't come out of there right now, I'm going to start cutting pieces off him until you do. Emma made a sound like a wounded animal. She started to stand, but Caleb held her back. Stay down, he ordered. That's my brother. They'll kill him. They'll kill all of you if I let you go out there. Caleb was thinking fast, trying to find a way out, a solution that didn't end with everyone dead. But the options were narrowing to nothing. Pike's men dragged Jacob off the horse and dumped him on the ground. The boy stirred, groaning. So he was alive. For now, last chance, Stone, Pike called. You and the girl and the baby come out, hands up, and maybe I let the boy live. Maybe I let you all live. But you've got about 10 seconds before I start getting creative with this knife. Caleb looked at Emma's desperate face, at baby Thomas, who'd started crying from all the noise and fear. He looked at Jacob lying in the snow, hurt and helpless. And he made his decision. I'm coming out, he called. Don't hurt the boy. I'm coming out. Caleb, no. Emma grabbed his arm. Listen to me, he said urgently. When I go out there, Pike's going to be focused on me. That's when you take Thomas and you run. There's a root cellar under the floor, behind the bed. You get in there and you stay hidden until it's safe. You understand? I can't leave you. Yes, you can, because I'm giving you a chance, and I need you to take it. He pulled something from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. It was the key to his wooden box. If I don't make it, you open that box. Inside are letters I wrote. They'll explain. He stopped, not sure what they'd explain. Just read them, and know that I'm sorry I couldn't save your family, but I tried. I swear I tried. Before Emma could respond, Caleb stood and walked to the door. He laid down his rifle and revolver, keeping only his knife hidden at his back. Then he lifted the bar and stepped out into the cold sunlight, his hands raised. Pike's men immediately surrounded him, patting him down and finding the knife. They took it and shoved him forward toward where Pike stood beside Jacob's unconscious form. "Smart choice," Pike said. "Stupid, but smart. You just saved the boy's life. For now, let them go," Caleb said. "The children. You can have me, have whatever you want. But let them go," Pike laughed. "You're not in a position to negotiate. But I'll tell you what, I'm curious about something. What's your connection to these kids? Why would a hermit who hasn't talked to another human being in 15 years suddenly decide to play hero for some orphans he'd never met? Because it was the right thing to do. The territorial marshal's name was Henry Blackwood, and he was the kind of lawman Caleb remembered from his cavalry days, honest, competent, and not easily intimidated. He'd brought 12 deputies with him, all well-armed and professional. Pike and his remaining men were disarmed and bound. The bodies of the fallen were covered with blankets, and Caleb stood on his porch with the 3 children, watching it all unfold with a sense of unreality. Marshal Blackwood approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Captain Stone, I'm Marshal Blackwood. The boy here," he gestured to Jacob, who was sitting on the porch steps with Emma tending to his wounds. "He rode into Pine Ridge about 2 hours ago, half dead and rambling about murders and land theft. Took me a bit to sort out his story, but once I understood what he was saying, I gathered every man I could and came as fast as possible." "You came just in time," Caleb said. "Another few minutes and—" He didn't finish. "Didn't need to, I know." Blackwood looked at Pike, now sitting in the snow with his hands bound behind his back. "I've been after Clayton Garrett for 3 years. Had reports he was operating in this territory under a false name, but I could never pin down his location. When the boy showed me that wanted poster and told me his story, everything fell into place. What happens now? Now we take statements, gather evidence, and prepare for trial. Garrett, will hang for what he's done. No question about that." Blackwood paused. "The boy also mentioned something about a land deed?" Jacob looked up. "I hid it before they caught me. Knew they'd search me, so I wrapped it in oilcloth and buried it under a distinctive rock formation about a mile down the trail. I can show you where." "Smart thinking," Blackwood said approvingly. "We'll retrieve it and file it properly with the land office. Make sure no one can dispute the children's claim." Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. It was really over. The children were safe. Pike would face justice. The nightmare was ending. But as the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion and pain took its place. His shoulder ached where he'd wrenched it climbing out of the mine. His hands were cut and bruised. And somewhere deeper, in a place he'd thought had gone numb 15 years ago, he felt the weight of what he'd learned. These children were family. His family. The last connection to Margaret, to the life he'd lost. Emma seemed to read his thoughts. She left Jacob and came to stand beside him, still holding baby Thomas. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "What Pike said? That my mother was your wife's sister?" Caleb looked down at her. Now that he knew, he could see the resemblance. Emma had Sarah's eyes, her determined chin. Jacob had the Mitchell family's height and build. Even Thomas, gurgling contentedly in Emma's arms, had that familiar blonde hair. "It's true," he said. "Your mother, Sarah, was my sister-in-law. We were close once before—" He stopped, the old pain rising up. "Before my wife and daughter died. Sarah came to the funeral. She tried to help me, tried to pull me back from the edge. But I pushed everyone away. I left my post, sold everything, and came here to be alone. I didn't know she'd moved west. Didn't know she'd started a family. By the time I might have thought to reach out, I'd convinced myself I had nothing left to reach out for." "So we really are your family," Emma said wonderingly. "You are. And I'm sorry. Sorry I wasn't there when your mother died. Sorry I didn't know about your father's trouble with Pike. Sorry it took a crisis to bring us together." Emma surprised him by taking his hand. "You came when we needed you most." "That's what matters." Jacob had joined them, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch one of the deputies had fashioned. "So what happens now?" he asked. "We've got the land but no house. No father to run things. I'm 16, but that's not old enough to manage a ranch on my own, not legally." It was a good question. The children had their land back, But they needed more than that. They needed stability, guidance, protection. Caleb found himself speaking before he'd fully thought it through. "You'll stay with me, all of you, until we can rebuild on your property, until Jacob's old enough to take over, until—" He paused, realizing what he was committing to. "Until you don't need me anymore." Emma's face lit up. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it." Caleb looked at each of them in turn. "Your father wanted you to have a future. Your mother wanted you to have family. I can't bring them back, but I can make sure their wishes are honored. I can make sure you're taken care of." "Captain Stone," Marshal Blackwood interrupted gently, "I'll need formal statements from all of you, and I'll need to understand the full extent of Pike's crimes. Can we talk inside?" They moved into the cabin, which, despite the bullet holes and shattered windows, still felt warmer than the snow-covered ground outside. Blackwood took detailed notes as Caleb, Jacob, and Emma each told their part of the story. The Marshal's expression grew darker as he heard about Pike's threats, the murder of James Holloway, the siege, and the revelation about the locket. "We'll need that locket as evidence," Blackwood said. "And the journal, if it survived." Jacob pulled the journal from inside his coat. "One of Pike's men tried to burn it like he ordered, but I'd already swapped it for a different book when I was playing dead. The real journal's right here." Blackwood took it carefully. "You're a resourceful young man. Your father would be proud. He taught me to think ahead," Jacob said quietly. "To always have a backup plan. I just wish—" His voice cracked. "I wish I'd been smart enough to save him." "No one could have saved him," Caleb said firmly. Pike had made up his mind. "What you did was survive, and you helped your sister and brother survive. That took more courage than most men ever show." Over the next hour they went through every detail. Blackwood was thorough, asking questions, clarifying timelines, making sure he had everything he needed for a solid case. When he was finally satisfied, he stood and shook Caleb's hand. "You did good work here, Captain. Not many men would have stepped up the way you did. I did what any decent person would do." "No," Blackwood said. "Most people would have turned them away, told themselves it wasn't their problem. You chose differently, and these children are alive because of it." After the Marshal left with his prisoners, a strange quiet settled over the cabin. The children were exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. Caleb made them eat simple food but hot and nourishing. Then he got Jacob settled on the bed with his shoulder properly bandaged, Emma on a makeshift pallet near the fire, and Thomas in a wooden crate padded with blankets that served as a cradle. Caleb sat at his table, looking at the wooden box he'd carried for 15 years. Slowly, he opened it. The contents were exactly as he remembered. The commission letter yellowed with age, the lock of his daughter's blonde hair, still tied with its ribbon, the daguerreotype of Margaret, her serious face looking back at him across the years, and the letters, dozens of them written in those first awful months of grief. He pulled one out at random and read it by lamplight. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "another day has passed in this place I've chosen for myself. The cabin is nearly finished. The mountains are beautiful in a harsh, indifferent way. I tell myself I'm building a new life, but we both know the truth. I'm hiding. I'm running from a world that took you from me, from a future that died with you and Sarah. I know you would tell me to live, to find purpose, to honor your memory by being the man you believed I was. But I don't know how to be that man without you." Caleb set the letter down, his vision blurring. How many years had he wasted? How much time had he thrown away, convincing himself that isolation was somehow noble, that staying separate from the world was the only way to protect himself from more loss? He looked at the children sleeping peacefully in his cabin. Emma's arm was draped protectively over Thomas's cradle. Jacob muttered something in his sleep, probably dreaming of his father. These children had lost everything, just as Caleb had. But they hadn't given up. They hadn't hidden themselves away. They'd fought, they'd endured, and they'd found the courage to ask for help. They'd taught him something he'd forgotten, that grief wasn't something to run from. It was something to carry, to honor, to transform into something meaningful. He carefully returned the letter to the box and closed the lid. But this time he didn't put it back on the table. Instead, he stood and walked to the fireplace, where a loose stone in the hearth concealed a small space. He'd built it years ago, thinking he might need to hide valuables. He placed the box inside, fitting the stone back over it. The memories would stay there, safe, but no longer dominating his daily existence. He would always carry Margaret and his daughter in his heart. But he wouldn't let that grief prevent him from living, from connecting, from being the man his wife had believed he could be. Outside, dawn was beginning to break. Caleb stepped onto the porch and looked out at the mountains. The same peaks he'd stared at for 15 years, the same valleys and ridges and endless sky. But everything felt different now. The isolation he'd sought felt less like safety and more like imprisonment. He heard a sound behind him and turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Too much has happened. My mind won't settle." She joined him, looking out at the view. "It's beautiful here. I can see why you stayed." "I stayed because I was afraid," Caleb said. "Afraid of losing anyone else. Afraid of caring and having that care torn away. So I convinced myself it was better to be alone. And now I know I was wrong. Your mother, Sarah, she tried to tell me that after Margaret died. She said that love and connection are what make life worth living, even knowing we might lose what we love. I didn't listen, didn't want to hear it." He looked down at Emma. "But you and your brothers have shown me she was right. You've all lost so much, but you haven't given up on each other. You haven't stopped caring." Emma leaned against him, and Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. "My father used to say that family is what keeps us human, that without people to care for and care about, we're just surviving, not living." He was a wise man. He was. "And he'd be grateful to you for saving us. We all are." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Behind them, inside the cabin, Thomas began to cry, a healthy, demanding sound. Emma smiled and went to tend to him, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd been caring for her baby brother for months. Caleb followed her inside and helped prepare a bottle. As he watched Emma feed Thomas, while Jacob slept peacefully, he felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years, hope for the future. There would be challenges ahead. The cabin wasn't big enough for 4 people. They'd need to expand or build something new on the children's land. Jacob would need time to heal, both physically and emotionally. Emma would need support as she navigated being both child and caretaker. Thomas would need the kind of attention and care that came from a stable home, but they would face those challenges together. As a family, Caleb looked at the space where the wooden box had been, then at the children who now filled his home with life and noise and need. He'd spent 15 years trying to protect himself from pain by refusing to let anyone in. It had taken 3 orphans and a crisis to teach him that the real tragedy wasn't loving and losing. It was never loving at all. 3 days after Pike's arrest, word came that he'd tried to escape while being transported to the territorial capital. The attempt had failed, but in the struggle one of the deputies had been badly injured. Marshal Blackwood rode up to the cabin personally to inform Caleb and to warn him that Pike's trial would likely be delayed while the deputy recovered. "There's something else," Blackwood said, his expression grave. "Pike had more men than we thought. We arrested 6 with him that day, but we've learned he had at least 3 more working for him in town. They scattered when they heard about his capture, but my sources say they're regrouping, planning something." Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Planning what?" "We're not sure. But Pike's men are loyal to him. He pays well, and he's got information on most of them that keeps them in line. They might try to break him out." Older Blackwood paused. "They might come after the witnesses, the children, you. Let them come," Caleb said flatly. "They'll find I'm ready. I can leave a deputy with you. At least until the trial." Caleb considered it, then shook his head. "A deputy would just be another target, and I'm not putting anyone else in danger. I'll handle it. Captain, I've handled worse odds before, Marshal. And I've got something now I didn't have then." Caleb glanced back at the cabin, where he could hear Emma teaching Jacob a song their mother used to sing. "I've got something worth protecting." Blackwood left reluctantly, but not before providing Caleb with extra ammunition and a warning to be vigilant. Caleb took the warning seriously. He'd seen enough of Pike's operation to know the man inspired both fear and loyalty in his followers. If they were planning something, it would be soon. That night, Caleb sat the children down and explained the situation. He didn't sugarcoat it or hide the danger. They deserve the truth, so what do we do? Jacob asked. His shoulder was healing well, and some of the color had returned to his face, but he was still weak. We prepare. We stay alert. And we don't go anywhere alone. Caleb had already been thinking through defensive positions, escape routes, contingencies. The old military training was fully engaged now. Emma, I need you to practice the signals we discussed. 3 quick knocks means danger. 2 long ones means all clear. I remember, Emma said. She'd taken to the tactical training with surprising aptitude, memorizing everything Caleb taught her. And Jacob, I know you're still healing, but I need you to be able to handle a rifle if it comes to that. Can you shoot with your good arm? Jacob nodded grimly. I can shoot. I don't think it'll come to violence, Caleb said, though he didn't entirely believe it. Pike's men are hired guns, not fanatics. With their boss locked up, they might just cut their losses and run. But we need to be ready in case they don't. The blue ribbon that Emma had worn through her ordeal now hung from a peg by the door, a reminder of how far they'd come and how much they'd survived. Caleb found himself looking at it often, drawing strength from what it represented. Family, courage, perseverance. 2 nights later, the attack came. Caleb woke to the sound he'd been dreading, horses approaching in the darkness, multiple riders, moving slowly to minimize noise. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Emma! Jacob, wake up! He called quietly. We've got company. The children were already stirring, trained now to sleep lightly and wake quickly. Emma gathered Thomas, while Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window position they designated for him. Caleb peered out into the darkness. He could see movement in the trees, at least 4 riders, maybe more. They were surrounding the cabin, taking up positions. Stone, a voice called out. We know you're in there. We're here for the children. Send them out and we'll let you live. Caleb didn't recognize the voice, but the threat was clear enough. You're making a mistake, he called back. The marshal knows about Pike's remaining men. If anything happens to us, you'll hang right alongside him. That's a risk we're willing to take. Pike takes care of his people, but only if we take care of business first. A shot rang out, punching through the cabin wall inches from where Caleb stood. He dropped low, returning fire toward the muzzle flash. Jacob fired from his position, and someone in the darkness cursed. Last chance, Stone. Send out the brats! Caleb's response was another carefully aimed shot. He heard a cry of pain, then the sound of someone retreating through the brush. All right then, the voice shouted. Have it your way. We'll burn you out. Caleb's blood ran cold. Fire was exactly what he'd feared most. The cabin was wood, dried by 15 winters. It would burn fast and hot, and in the chaos of a fire, Pike's men could pick them off as they fled. He looked at Emma and Jacob, saw his own fear reflected in their eyes. This was the moment, the real test, not just of his ability to protect them, but of his commitment to this new life, this new family. Emma, he said calmly, take Thomas and get to the root cellar we discussed. Jacob, you're going with them. What? No, I'm staying and fighting. You're protecting your sister and brother. That's the fight that matters. Caleb gripped the boy's shoulder. I need you to keep them safe. If something happens to me, you get them out through the back exit we dug, and you run for Pine Ridge. Don't look back. Don't try to be a hero. Just get them to safety. That's your mission. Understood? Jacob's jaw worked, torn between wanting to fight and knowing Caleb was right. Finally he nodded. Understood. Good man. Caleb turned to Emma. Remember what I taught you. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Don't come out until you hear the all-clear signal or until dawn, whichever comes first. Emma's eyes were wide with fear, but she held herself together. What about you? I'll be fine. I've been through worse than this. It was only half a lie. He had been through worse, but he'd also had trained soldiers at his back then, not just his own wits and weapons. He helped them open the hidden trap door beneath the bed, revealing the small root cellar he'd dug years ago for storing vegetables through the winter. It was cramped and dark, but it was hidden and relatively safe. Emma climbed down first with Thomas, then Jacob followed, pulling the door closed above them. Caleb pushed the bed back into place and scattered a rug over the trapdoor. From above, it would be nearly impossible to spot unless someone knew exactly what to look for. Outside, he could hear Pike's men moving into position. One of them was gathering kindling, preparing to set the fire. Caleb had maybe minutes before the cabin became an inferno. He tied Emma's blue ribbon around his rifle barrel, a talisman and a reminder of what he was fighting for. Then he checked his weapons one final time, rifle loaded, revolver loaded, knife sharp and ready. The cavalry saber hung above the fireplace where it had always been. He took it down, feeling its familiar weight. The time for hiding was over. The time for tactical retreat had passed. Now it was time to do what he'd once done better than almost anyone, fight. But this time he wasn't fighting for orders or territory or glory. He was fighting for family, for the 3 children hidden beneath his floor, for the memory of Margaret and Sarah, for the chance at redemption he'd been given when Emma stumbled through the snow to his door. Caleb Stone stepped out onto his porch, weapons ready, and faced Pike's remaining men in the darkness. The men in the darkness froze when they saw him emerge. They'd expected him to cower inside, to try to defend the cabin from within. They hadn't expected him to come out to meet them. Well now, the leader said. Caleb could see him better now in the starlight, a lean man with a cruel face and quick eyes. That's either brave or stupid, Stone. It's practical, Caleb said calmly. You want to burn my cabin? You'll have to go through me first. And I guarantee you won't like what happens when you... Try. There's 4 of us and one of... You, I faced worse odds. Caleb's voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who'd done exactly that and survived. And I'm standing between you and 3 orphaned children. That means I'm not backing down, not negotiating, and not giving you any more warnings. Leave now while you can still walk away. The leader laughed, but there was an edge to it. Pike pays us good money to finish jobs. We don't walk away. Pike's locked up waiting to hang. He's not paying anyone anything anymore. He's got money stashed. And he's got friends who'll make sure we're taken care of as long as we take care of his problems first. The leader gestured to his men. Last chance, Stone. Step aside. Caleb's answer was to level his rifle at the man's chest. The leader dove for cover as Caleb fired. The bullet missed by inches, and then everything dissolved into chaos. Pike's men opened fire from their positions, and Caleb moved like he'd been trained to move decades ago, fast, unpredictable. Using every bit of cover the terrain offered, he fired the rifle twice more, then dropped it and drew his revolver. One of Pike's men went down with a cry. Another scrambled for better position, and Caleb put a bullet close enough to make him think twice about advancing. But they were spreading out, trying to flank him. Caleb fell back toward the cabin, using the structure itself for cover. Bullets punched through the wooden walls, and he hoped desperately that the children were staying down, staying quiet in their hiding place. The leader made a dash toward the cabin's side, trying to reach the kindling pile. Caleb tracked him and fired, but the hammer fell on an empty chamber. Out of bullets in the revolver, no time to reload. Caleb dropped the gun and drew the cavalry saber in one smooth motion. The leader skidded to a stop, eyes going wide at the sight of 3 feet of sharpened steel catching the starlight. "You've got to be joking," the man said. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The leader drew his own knife, a wicked-looking blade meant for close work. They circled each other, both looking for an opening. Behind them, the other 2 men were advancing, but they'd stopped shooting, not wanting to hit their own leader. The leader lunged first, his knife seeking Caleb's midsection. Caleb parried with the saber, the blades meeting with a sharp ring of metal on metal. He followed through with a cut that forced the man back. They traded blows in the darkness, steel flashing. The leader was younger and faster, but Caleb had decades of experience and the absolute determination of a man protecting his family. Every move was economical, precise, drawing on training so deeply ingrained it had become instinct. The leader overextended on a thrust, and Caleb saw his opening. He swept the saber in a wide arc that caught the man's knife hand. The blade went flying, and the leader stumbled back, clutching his bleeding hand. Caleb leveled the saber at his throat. "Call them off now!" The leader looked past Caleb at his remaining men, then back at the blade pressed against his jugular. He could see his own death reflected in Caleb's eyes. "Stand down," he called out. "Stand down, damn it!" The shooting stopped. An eerie quiet settled over the clearing, broken only by the leader's labored breathing and the distant sound of wind through the pines. "Drop your weapons and get on your horses," Caleb ordered. "All of you. Ride out of here and don't come back. If I see any of you again, if I even hear you're still in this territory, I'll hunt you down myself. And next time I won't give you the chance to surrender." The men hesitated, looking to their wounded leader for guidance. "Do it," the leader said through gritted teeth. "He's crazy enough to mean it." They dropped their guns and slowly backed toward their horses. Caleb kept the saber trained on the leader until the man's companions were mounted and ready to ride. Only then did he lower the blade enough for the leader to back away. The man clutched his bleeding hand and moved toward his own horse. Before mounting, he turned back. "Pike was right about you. You're dangerous, but you're also a fool. You think this is over? I think you have about 10 seconds to get on that horse before I change my mind about letting you leave," Caleb said flatly. The leader mounted up and spurred his horse. The 4 riders disappeared into the darkness, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into silence. Caleb stood alone in the clearing, saber still in hand, listening to make sure they were truly gone. His heart was pounding, adrenaline still flooding his system. He'd won, but it had been close. Too close. He turned back to the cabin and gave the all-clear signal. 2 long knocks on the door frame. After a moment, he heard movement beneath the floorboards. The bed shifted, the trapdoor opened, and Emma's pale face appeared in the opening. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," Caleb confirmed. "They're gone." Emma climbed out, still holding Thomas with Jacob right behind her. They rushed to Caleb, and he gathered them close, feeling their hearts beating against his chest, feeling the weight of their fear and relief. "You're bleeding," Emma said, noticing the cut on his arm where one of the bullets had grazed him. "It's nothing." "I'm fine." He looked down at their upturned faces. "We're all fine, and we're going to stay that way. But what if they come back?" Jacob asked. "What if Pike sends more men?" "He won't. Word's going to spread about what happened tonight. People will know that anyone who comes after this family will have to answer to me." Caleb's voice was firm, certain. "And I'm done running, done hiding. This is our home now, and I'll defend it and all of you with everything I have." Emma was still holding the blue ribbon that had been tied to his rifle. She looked at it, then at Caleb. "My mother gave this to me to remind me that family takes care of family." "Your family now, Uncle Caleb. Real family, Uncle Caleb." The words hit him harder than any bullet could have. He'd been Captain Stone, then just Stone, then the Hermit, the Mountain Man. But Uncle Caleb, that was something different. Something that meant belonging, connection, purpose. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am, and I always will be." They went back inside the cabin together. Caleb barred the door and reloaded his weapons, just in case. But deep down, he knew the real fight was over. Pike's men would scatter now, more afraid of the crazy mountain man than they were loyal to their imprisoned boss. As Emma settled Thomas back to sleep and Jacob checked the windows one more time, Caleb stood by the fireplace and looked at the space where his wooden box had been hidden. The past was still there, still part of him. But it no longer defined him. He had a future now, a family, a purpose beyond mere survival, and he was ready to fight for it. Spring came to the mountains like a promise kept. The snow melted into rushing streams. Wildflowers pushed through the wet earth, and the pines seemed to stand taller in the warming air. For Caleb Stone, it felt like more than just a change of seasons. It felt like a new beginning, 6 weeks after Pike's final attempt on their lives, Marshal Blackwood rode up to the cabin with news. Garrett Pike had been tried, convicted, and hanged for murder. His remaining men had scattered to the winds, and warrants had been issued for those involved in the attack on Caleb's cabin. The threat was finally truly over. The land deeds been properly filed, Blackwood told them, as they sat on the newly expanded porch Caleb and Jacob had built together. No one can dispute the children's claim now. It's theirs, legal and clear. Emma, who'd been listening from the doorway with Thomas on her hip, came out to join them. What about the mineral rights Papa wrote about? The gold and silver? Also yours, Blackwood confirmed. Though I'd advise you to sit on that information for a while. News like that can attract the wrong kind of attention, and you've had enough trouble for one lifetime. We're in no rush, Caleb said. The children have time to decide what they want to do with their land. Blackwood studied Caleb with knowing eyes. You planning to stick around? Help them make those decisions. As long as they'll have me. Good. The marshal stood and shook Caleb's hand. The territory needs more men like you, Captain. Men who stand up when it matters. After Blackwood left, Caleb and the children stood together, looking out at the view. From here, they could see both Caleb's cabin and, in the distance, the valley where the Holloway property lay. Soon, they'd begin building a new house there, bigger than James Holloway's old one, designed to hold a growing family. Uncle Caleb, Emma said. She called him that naturally now, without hesitation. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why did you really help us? That first day when I showed up half frozen at your door, you could have just given me some food and sent me on my way. Why did you decide to help? Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. Honestly, at first, I told myself it was just the right thing to do, that any decent person would help children in danger. But the truth is more complicated than that. He looked at each of them, Emma, now 13, and growing into the strong young woman her mother had been. Jacob, 16, and already showing signs of the man he'd become, responsible and brave. And Thomas, nearly 9 months old now, healthy and happy, and completely unaware of the danger he'd survived. When your sister came to my door, Caleb continued, she reminded me of someone I'd lost, and when I looked at you, at all of you, I saw a chance to be the man I used to be, the man I'd stopped being when grief taught me it was safer to be alone. He paused. You gave me back something I thought was gone forever. You gave me purpose, family, a reason to care about tomorrow. So we helped you too, Jacob said thoughtfully, more than you know. Emma shifted Thomas to her other hip. My mother used to tell me stories about Aunt Margaret. She said she was kind and brave and that she loved you very much. Do you think she'd be proud of what you did for us? Caleb felt his throat tighten. I think she'd be proud of all of us. Proud of your courage. Proud of how you took care of each other. And yes, maybe proud that I finally remembered what she tried to teach me, that love is worth the risk of loss. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the valley gold. In the distance, a hawk circled on thermal currents, free and graceful against the vast sky. We should start on the house soon, Jacob said, before summer gets too hot for the heavy work. Agreed, Caleb said. I've been drawing up plans. Thought maybe we'd include a workshop for you, Emma, somewhere you can work on the healing herbs you've been studying. And a study for Jacob, since he'll need space for managing the ranch accounts, and a nursery for Thomas, Emma added. A real room of his own. Of course, they began discussing details, and Caleb felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. This was what family sounded like. Planning, dreaming, building toward a shared future. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Caleb retrieved the wooden box from its hiding place in the hearth. He opened it one more time and looked at the contents. The commission letter, the lock of blonde hair, Margaret's photograph, and the letters he'd written in his grief. He took out one of the letters and read it again by lamplight. The words were painful, raw with loss. But they were also part of his story, part of the journey that had led him to this moment. Carefully, he added something new to the box, Emma's blue ribbon, which she'd given to him after the final confrontation, saying she didn't need it anymore because she had family to remind her now. He placed it beside the lock of hair, two symbols of two different times, two different families, connected by love and loss and redemption. Then he closed the box and returned it to its hiding place. The past would always be part of him, but it no longer imprisoned him. He'd learned to carry his grief without letting it crush him, to honor his memories without living in them. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of Thomas babbling and Emma laughing as she tried to feed him breakfast. Jacob was already outside, tending to the horses with the easy competence he'd developed over the past weeks. Caleb stood on the porch with his coffee, watching his family, and yes, they were his family now in every way that mattered, begin their day. The mountains rose around them solid and eternal. The valley spread below, green with spring growth and bright with possibility. He thought of the man he'd been when this story started, isolated, grieving, convinced that safety lay in separation. And he thought of the man he was now, connected, purposeful, willing to fight for the people he loved. A hand-carved wooden sign leaned against the porch railing, waiting to be hung at the entrance to the Holloway property. Jacob had carved it with Caleb's help, the letters deep and clear. Stone Family Ranch, not Holloway. Not just Caleb's or just the children's. Stone Family Ranch. Acknowledging the bond they'd forged through crisis and courage, through loss and redemption. Emma came out to stand beside him, following his gaze to the sign. "Think Papa would approve?" she asked. "I think he'd be honored," Caleb said. "Your father wanted you to have a future, a legacy. We're building that together now." "Together," Emma agreed. "The way family should be." As the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and green, Caleb Stone felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Contentment. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of joy, strong enough to carry the weight of memory. He'd come to these mountains to hide from life, but life, in the form of 3 desperate children, had found him anyway. And in saving them, he'd saved himself. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let others in. Sometimes the strongest thing is admitting you need family as much as they need you. And sometimes the most profound healing comes not from isolation, but from connection. Caleb had learned all of this the hard way. But as he looked at his family, at the life they were building together, he knew every painful step had been worth it. The mountains would always be there, solid and unchanging. But they no longer represented retreat. Now they represented home. Not a place to hide, but a place to build. Not a monument to the past, but a foundation for the future. And that future, Caleb Stone thought, as he called the children together to begin their day, looked brighter than anything he'd dared to imagine.